Hello friends, this video on diversity in living organisms part 8 is brought to you by examfear.com. No more fear from exam. Right? So with this we will end our discussion on the kingdom Monera. So I hope you got some idea on Monera kingdom. So now all bacteria which fall under Monera kingdom, it will share some common characteristics like they all will be prokaryotes, they all will be unicellular, their mode of nutrition will be either autotrophic or heterotrophic. Right? So now let us have a look at the second kingdom, that is Protista. So let us now look at the characteristics of this kingdom, Protista. So the first property, these are eukaryotes, unlike the Monera kingdom. That means they have specific membrane-bound cell organelles and a distinct nucleus. Like as I mentioned before, that these were the basic things based on which these 5 kingdoms were classified. So Monera were prokaryotes, whereas Protista were eukaryotes with specific membrane-bound organelles and a specific nucleus, and the fluid inside the nucleus was nucleoplasm. The nucleus was also surrounded by a specific nuclear membrane. Right? Mostly unicellular, that is made of one cell. So here you notice the term mostly. That means there are possibilities that some of them might be multicellular. Correct? Okay. As far as nutrition is concerned, again, some are autotrophic while others are heterotrophic. So autotrophic again is the same thing, that is they can prepare their own food, whereas heterotrophic, those which depend on others for their food. So here if you compare Monera and Protista, what do you see? As far as those 3 criteria are concerned, as far as the cell structure is concerned, Monera were prokaryotes and Protista are eukaryotes. As far as body organization is concerned, both of them are unicellular, so there is no body organization as such. As far as nutrition is concerned, both are again either autotrophic or heterotrophic. They prefer moist and aquatic habitats, so that means water is something which is very much suitable for their livelihood. So they grow where there is water, so they prefer moist and aquatic habitats. So now let us look at the various categories of protists. So this kingdom was earlier named as Protista, so now people often call it as protists. Right? Okay, so let us see what are the different types of protists. Actually, these protists are also classified broadly into 3 categories. So let us look at the different categories. So the first category is plant-like protists. That means the protists which have certain similarities with plants. So under these kind of protists come algae. So as I mentioned to you before also, that in algae we have many different types of algae which are named after their color. So blue-green algae was the cyanobacteria which falls under Monera. So under Protista falls the red algae and the brown algae. So it is very evident from the picture that this is known as a red algae because of its color, and again this is known as brown algae because of its color. So this red algae and brown algae falls under the category of plant-like protists, because if you look at them, their look and feel is very similar to a plant. That is why they are known as plant-like protists. The next category was animal-like protists. That means protists which are actually protists, but they have few things which are very similar to animals. So examples of such protists, under these kind of protists falls Protozoa. So under the category Protozoa, examples of Protozoa are amoeba, paramecium. So this is amoeba, this is paramecium. So these are animal-like protists. So if you look at the behavior of amoeba, the way it moves, the way it eats things, so they do not show much resemblance with plants, but they give some resemblance with animals, and that is why they fall under the category of animal-like protists. So we will talk about amoeba, paramecium in little more detail in the coming slides. Now there is another protist called Euglena. Now this Euglena is little different. It has both plant-like behavior as well as animal-like behavior. So this is Euglena. So I cannot say explicitly that it falls under the category of plant-like protists or it falls under the category of animal-like protists. It has both. It shows characteristics of both of them actually. So when I say that it is plant-like, why do I say it is plant-like? Because they are autotrophs. So plants have this property of performing photosynthesis and they can prepare their own food. So this euglena is also autotroph. So that is why we say that it is plant-like. At the same time, it is animal-like. When we look at its structure, it doesn't give the resemblance of a plant. So when we look at its structure, when we look at the way it moves from one place to another, so we feel that it is similar to animal. So that is why euglena is a protist which have both plant-like characters as well as animal-like characters. Now the third category is fungus-like protists. So now you remember the 5 classes, the 5 kingdoms into which the living organisms are classified. The first one was Monera, so that we have completed, so forget it. The next one is Protist, which we are discussing, and the third is fungi, fourth is Plantae, and fifth is Animalia. So here you see these Protists are either similar to plants, are either similar to fungi, which is the next kingdom, or they have some similarity with plants, which is the next which is again the next kingdom, or they have some similarity with animals, which is the 5th kingdom. So based on that, these protists are classified as plant-like, animal-like, or fungus-like. So under fungus-like protists, we have slime molds and water molds. However, not only, do you understand what is a mold? When I say mold, it is nothing but you'd have seen in your houses that when something gets rotten, what happens? Suppose if you have an apple, if you keep that apple for days together, what will happen? It will start getting decayed. Now once it gets decayed completely, you see that a layer of fungus covers it. Not only an apple, it happens with a bread as well. So they are fungus. So these molds are nothing but there are many different types of molds actually. So the molds itself falls under the category of fungi. But slime molds and water molds, these are the 2 categories of molds which are not actually fungus but they are protists. Now why are they protists and not fungus? We will see that as we discuss exclusively about slime molds and water molds. So slime molds are those molds which are quite slimy. As the name suggests, slime means little slimy and slippery. So these kind of molds are seen in these kind of areas, and water molds are the molds which are found in water, obviously. So we will talk about these kind of molds also. So we will discuss each of these categories of protists one by one. So let us start with the first one, that is the plant-like protists, where we will talk about algae. So these are the plant-like protists. They can be unicellular or multicellular. So when I talk about the cellularity, so when I say they can be unicellular or multicellular as well, that's because mostly it is seen that the brown algae are multicellular, whereas the red algae are unicellular. That is why I said that protists are mostly unicellular, because most of the protists are generally unicellular, except for few like the brown algae, right? The next is they are autotrophs, that is they can perform photosynthesis. So even these kind of algae, a good amount of photosynthetic production is due to them because they produce a lot of food. Now the more food they produce, the better it is, because there are so many other organisms which are also dependent on these kind of autotrophs, right? Okay. They prefer marine habitats. They are generally found, as you can see in this picture also, they are generally found under the water, that too in the seas. So now if you look at the red algae, so when I talk about the size of these red algae and the brown algae, the red algae are generally small, whereas the brown algae could be long. They can be as long as around 60 to 70 meters. So you can imagine how long they can be. And you can see from the picture also that they look to be quite long. And these brown algae are considered to be the largest and fastest growing seaweed. What do we mean by seaweed? Weed means any plant which just grows anywhere it gets placed. We do not need to actually give lot of attention to that plant. That is known as a weed. We have spoken about weed also in one of our previous lessons, right? So this brown algae is considered to be the largest and fastest growing seaweed. So again, I should note that down here. So these are the largest and fastest growing seaweed, right? So what do we see about the plant protists? Their appearance similar to plants. They are autotrophs, that is they can prepare their own food. That is again a similarity with plants. They can be unicellular, they can be multicellular, and they prefer marine habitats. So these were some of them. And generally, another important thing is, even though they prefer marine habitats, that does not mean that they can grow in anywhere and everywhere, wherever they find water. They generally prefer clean and running water, and that is why they prefer marine habitats, because there the water is clean and also the water is running. Right? So even though they prefer marine habitat, however, sometimes freshwater species are also found. We also see red algae or brown algae in freshwaters. Okay, so with this, let us go to the animal-like protists, that is the Protozoa. So these are animal-like protists. They are unicellular heterotrophs. So as I said, mostly protists are unicellular, so they are also unicellular. They are similar to animals in the sense that they are also heterotrophs. They cannot prepare their own food and they depend on others. Some of them can be parasitic. So again, as I mentioned before also, under heterotrophic nutrition also you may have many different types. So being parasitic is one of the types. Parasitic means they live inside the body of some other organisms and they can cause disease in that organism. So they are said to be parasitic. So some of the examples of protozoa are Plasmodium, which causes malaria. Malaria is a very common disease, right? It happens due to the mosquito bite. Now, what happens in the mosquito bite? So, in the mosquito bite, this protozoa, Plasmodium, is actually transferred into the body of the human beings. So, this Plasmodium enters the body of the human being and it causes the disease malaria. Similarly, there is another protozoa called Trypanosoma. So this trypanosoma causes a disease called sleeping sickness. So these are some examples of protozoa which are parasitic in nature, that is which resides in the body of some organism and causes diseases in them. But that does not mean that all protozoa are bad or all protozoa are harmful. It is not that all protists are harmful, it is just that some of them are parasitic, and that too it is not. For example, in case of trypanosoma, it has got many different species of trypanosoma or many different varieties of trypanosoma. Now all of them do not cause a disease, only some species are harmful. So let us look at some other examples as well. So we will talk about some other examples also. For example, amoeba, paramecium, or euglena, these are also examples of protozoa, but they are not always harmful to the human beings. Correct? Okay. So let us look at the third category of protists, that is the fungus-like protists, in which we will talk about molds. Now, the first thing to be mentioned here is that not all molds fall under the category of protists. I mentioned it before also, right? So only slime molds and water molds fall under this category. So this is the slime molds and this is water molds. So only these two types of molds fall under this category. So now, did you get this idea that what are molds? So when I talk of molds, they are actually, I can give you this example which will help you understand what exactly are molds. As I mentioned before also, if you have something which gets rotten, for example, you would have seen, let us take the example of an apple. Now, if you keep an apple for months together, what will happen? First, the apple will start drying up, right, from outside. then it will tend to become soft, and then gradually you will see that the entire apple is getting covered with a net-like structure, mostly something in grayish white colored and some net-like structure. So these filamentous structure, or this is known as mold, and molds fall under the category of fungi. So they fall under the kingdom fungi. But not all molds are fungus. Most of the molds are fungus, but the slime molds and the water molds, they fall under the kingdom of protists. Now you might ask, when all molds fall under the category of fungus, why is it that these two kinds of mold fall under the category of protists? That's because there are certain things which are not characteristics of fungi but which are seen in slime molds and water molds. So we will talk about them. So these are also why. Now the first question is, why are they fungus like protists? What is the similarity with fungus? The similarity is that they are heterotrophs. They feed on dead and decomposed matter. So as I said, heterotrophs means they depend on others. Now there are many ways by which they can depend on others. So one way was being parasitic. The other way is feeding on dead and decomposed matter. So these such heterotrophs are known as saprotrophs. Right? So this is a characteristic of fungi, because fungi are generally saprotrophic, that is, they feed on dead and decomposed matter. So this is something which is similar with fungus, and that is why they are known as fungus-like protists. Now let us see what is the dissimilarity with fungus. So if all other molds fall under the category of fungus, and even if these molds also have the same kind of nutrition as fungus, then why is it categorized under protists? So that means there has to be some dissimilarity. Now they are not classified under fungi because of many reasons. So one of the reasons is, in fungi they generally have a cell wall, and the cell wall is made up of chitin. What is chitin now? Chitin is it is a polysaccharide, or it is you can just consider it as a polymer which is made up of glucose. For now, I am not going to discuss in detail about chitin now. So the cell wall of fungus is made up of chitin. So in this case, they do not have that specific kind of a cell wall. There is no concept of cell wall in this case, in slime molds and water molds. So that is one thing. The second thing is that in case of fungi, they are all immobile. But in case of slime molds and water molds, when they are observed very closely, it is seen that there is movement in slime molds and water molds. So they are not immobile like fungi. So they are capable of moving. So that was one other dissimilarity. The third dissimilarity was the way by which they reproduce. In fungi, the reproduction happens both sexually and as well as asexually. But in case of these slime molds and water molds, the reproduction generally happens with the help of spores. Right? So their reproductive method was also different. So these were some of the dissimilarities because of which the slime molds and the water molds were not categorized under fungi. Rather, they were categorized under the protists. So they were known as the fungus-like protists. Right? Now, how can we differentiate between a fungi and a protist-like fungi? I mean, how can you differentiate between a mold which is a fungus and a mold which is a fungus-like protist? Now generally, as I said, the molds will generally grow in the form of long branching filamentous structure, and these structures, so here you can see some net-like structures. I mean, these are nothing but the branches actually. So this filamentous or branching structure is given a name. These are known as hyphae. Right? So they grow in the form of hyphae. This branching keeps on increasing. Right? Now, this hyphae in case of this fungus-like protists is generally colored. But in case of fungi, the hyphae is generally white. So in case of, so how do we distinguish? Just by the look, how do we distinguish that whether it is a fungus or a fungus-like protist? The hyphae is generally colored in case of protists, but it is generally white in case of fungi. Right? So now we understood that these fungus-like protists, they have similarity with fungus in their nutrition, but they have dissimilarity with fungus in their reproduction, in the cell wall, as well as in their mobility. So because of which they are not categorized under fungi. Now another interesting thing which we observe here is that these fungus-like protists have similarity with both plant-like protists as well as animal-like protists. How? That's because these protists are heterotrophs, which is a similarity with the animal-like protists, right? So the fungus-like protists, so these fungus-like protists have similarity with both plant-like protists as well as animal-like protists. So how is it similar to plant-like protists? They are similar to plant-like protists because they also have a cell wall. And the cell wall is similarity with plants. And how is it similar with the animal-like protists? Because they are heterotrophs. Right? So the fungus-like protists have similarity with both plant as well as animals. Clear? So this is all that I would like to discuss regarding the three categories of the protists, and I hope that the information is clear and is helpful to you. Okay, so this was all about the three different categories of protists. Let us now talk about locomotion in protists. As I mentioned in the previous slide, that the protists are capable of movement. They can move from one place to another. So what are the different ways by which they move from one place to another? Different protists have different methods of locomotion. Okay, so let us look at some of the methods of locomotion. So one method is with the help of cilia, and a protist which makes use of cilia for its locomotion is paramecium. So paramecium is a protozoa or an animal-like protist which moves from one place to another with the help of cilia. So what are cilia? Cilia are hair-like structures arising from the surface of a cell. So if you look at the paramecium body, you can see that there are small hair-like structures on the surface, right? So these hair-like structures arises from the cell surface and they actually helps in locomotion. They are capable of rhythmic motion. That means the motion is at periodic intervals. So the motion will take place periodically. Multiple short cilia exist. So these cilia are not very long. Their size is very small, but numerous cilia exist because they are present throughout the surface of the cell. So there are too many cilia which are present and they help in rhythmic motion. Then let us look at another method of locomotion, that is by the use of flagella. So let us see what is flagella and which organism uses it. So euglena is the protist which uses flagella for moving from one place to another. So it is a long whip-like extension of the organism. So here you can see in this picture, this is a whip-like extension. It is a tail-like structure and it is just one single piece. For example, in case of cilia, there were multiple cilia, right? But in this case, there is just one single flagella. So one or two long flagella exists and not more. Sometimes two flagella also exists, but not more than that. You do not have those multiple number of flagella as you saw in case of cilia. So this single or two flagella will help the euglena to move from one position to another. There is another way of locomoting from one point to another, and that is with the help of pseudopodia. So the P is silent here. What is pseudopodia? Pseudo. What does the word pseudo means? Pseudo means false. So what can it mean? False podia. What does it mean? Actually, the term pseudopodia means false feet. And who uses this for locomotion? Amoeba. So here you can see amoeba. See, I think you are looking at, or you are seeing these organisms for the first time, because they are all at a microscopic level. I mean, these organisms are very, very small, and we do not see them with our naked eye in our day-to-day life. So maybe you are looking at these pictures for the first time. And anyways, we are not going to study in detail about each of them. Like, we are not going to spend a lot of time in studying only about amoeba, or only about paramecium, or only about euglena. But at least you get used to with how they look. At least look at the pictures and get some idea that how do they look. So these amoeba, if you see, it is a unicellular organism, right? Just one cell. So where do you think they have specific eyes and ears and nose and feet? They don't have anything like that, because a single cell is performing all the functions. So pseudopodia is the false feet. That means actually the feet is not there, but there is something which actually functions as feet. So what is that? Let us see. It is a temporary extension of the cytoplasm. So that means this cytoplasm. What is cytoplasm? The fluid which is present inside the cell. Right? So cytoplasm is present everywhere inside this amoeba. So it is a temporary extension of cytoplasm. So that means maybe the cytoplasm itself will extend somewhat like this for movement. And this way the amoeba can move from one point to another point. So by temporary extension of cytoplasm. Interesting, right? So this not only helps in locomotion, it also helps in feeding. That means amoeba gets its food. It doesn't have a specific mouth or something, right? So this extension of cytoplasm also helps the amoeba to get its food. So let us see how it helps in feeding. Let us look at this picture. So let us suppose this is the amoeba and this is a food particle. Now this food particle can be anything. It can be another living organism, or it can be some other thing. So it can be anything. Let us suppose if this is the food and this is the amoeba. So in order to get this food, the food will not come to the amoeba on its own. The amoeba has to go and get the food. So what will it do? The cytoplasm will extend itself temporarily like this. So you can see it is a temporary extension of the cytoplasm, and this temporary extension will gradually trap the food. So here you can see that the food is trapped. Now once the food is trapped inside the cytoplasm, a food vacuole is created and the food is finally absorbed by the amoeba. So this is how amoeba actually intakes its food, and this process is often known as phagocytosis. So however, we are not going to discuss about phagocytosis in much detail now, but I just told you to make you understand that how this false feet actually functions. So the false feet is nothing but it is the cytoplasm itself, but there is a temporary extension of the cytoplasm, and this extension, so it not only helped in engulfing the food, but it also helped the amoeba to move from one point to another, because it was earlier here. So now it reached here by temporary extension, right? So these are some of the ways by which the protists move from one place to another: cilia, flagella, and pseudopodia. So let us now look at the importance of protists. Do you think that they are very much important? Because maybe you would have heard the name of these protists. So what are the organisms that fall under the category of protists? Amoeba, paramecium, plasmodium, trypanosoma, euglena, slime molds, water molds, red algae, brown algae. These are some of the organisms which fall under the category of protists. Do you think that these names are very popular? Do you keep hearing these names every now and then? You really don't, right? So sometimes you might think that why the hell am I studying about these protists and all? I don't get to see them daily, or I don't meet them daily. So what is their significance? These protists are a source of food for many other life forms. Because you just look at the variety of life forms existing on earth. So there are so many life forms who need, and everybody needs food for their survival. So these protists act as a source of food for many other life forms. Not only that, it is also used in medical research, because it is used for preparing many medicines that helps to control the blood pressure problems or digestion problems. So it is also used in that ways in medical research. It is also valuable in industry. It is used in puddings and ice creams. You might be wondering how come protists are useful in puddings and ice creams. You would have seen that if you want to prepare ice cream or pudding at your home, you need something called a gelling agent. So that gelling agent will actually give that texture to the ice cream or the puddings, right? So what is that gelling agent? We go to a shop and we buy a packet of gelling agent, but that gelling agent is actually nothing but it is obtained from red algae. So there is something called carrageenan which is obtained from red algae, and that is used as a gelling agent and which helps us in making puddings and ice creams. Also, there are some chemicals which are obtained from algae which are useful in making plastics. And you know, plastics, ice creams, puddings, these are some things which are like quite nicely used by people. So that way is also protists are valuable in industry. So how the protists are valuable in industry? Because they help in making the gelling agents. So from where we get the gelling agents? It is obtained from carrageenan from red algae. Right? So this is the significance of protists, and therefore we should not keep a myth in our mind that if we talk about protists, they are always going to cause disease in human beings and they are always bad. It is not like that. There are only some species of protists which are parasitic in nature or which can cause diseases in human beings, but not all of them are like that. Right? So what did we discuss in protists? So in protists we discussed that they are mostly unicellular, however some of them can be multicellular. Their nutrition can be autotrophic or heterotrophic, and they are eukaryotes, that is they have specific cell organelles and specific membrane bound organelles. Right? So they were the basic characteristics of protists. They are of three categories: plant-like, animal-like and fungus-like. Plant-like are those who are autotrophs, similar to plants. Animal-like are those which are heterotrophs and which can move from one place to another, that is, which are mobile. And fungus-like are those which are heterotrophic, such that they feed on dead and decomposed matter. And also they are mobile, because fungi are generally immobile, but these are mobile. So they fall under the category of fungus-like protists. Clear? So with this, I'll end. Thank you. Please visit www.examfear.com to watch more videos, attempt free online test, get free study material, find tutors and mentors. Thank you once again.